You don't know how many times I just sat in dark alleys or go back streets and just sit there and just talk, and thought. I mean, what is going on here? There was somebody telling me, Paul, it's time to kill. Paul, it's time to kill.
Paul Michael Stephani, aka the Weepy Voiced Killer, was a serial killer active between 1980 and 1982 in the area of St. Paul, Minneapolis. Paul Stephani was named the Weepy Voiced Killer because on several occasions, he made anonymous phone calls to the police with a high-pitched voice to report his own crimes. Background: Paul Michael Stephani was born on September 8, 1944. When he was 3 years of age, his mother remarried and they went to live with his stepfather in Austin, Minnesota. While his stepfather worked as a meat packer, his mother stayed at home. It has been reported that his stepfather was abusive to him. Paul was a devout Catholic. His family was highly religious, and inculcated in him the strong dogmas of the Catholic faith. After high school, Paul worked in several odd jobs. During the earlier 80s, he was working mainly as a janitor. Paul Stephani was married to Beverly Leader, and had a daughter with her. But later he divorced his wife and cut all contact with both, abandoning his daughter. He had a history of mental illness, and was once convicted of aggravated assault. Although this conviction was not directly related to his murders, in the end, it played an important role during the investigation. The killings. Victim number 1. Karen Potak. On New Year's Eve 1980, Paul Stephani attacked his first victim, 20-year-old college student Karen Potak. Karen was a university student who had just arrived in St. Paul to have a party with her sisters. It was reported she was in a foul mood, and left the party without a jacket. Her sisters thought she was going home, so they went ahead and waited for her. Karen left the party after midnight inebriated, and wandered around the city. Paul Stephani was driving down an alley when he saw Karen walking without a jacket. He stopped the car and told her to get inside to warm up.
She got in my car and I gave her my jacket until I said the heat will be on in a minute. I had to clean some of the ice off the windshield.
Karen entered the car, and Paul offered her his jacket. Paul Stephani took her then to a secluded area, and attacked her. He raped her, and bludgeoned her with a tire iron at least 10 times, inflicting severe injuries to her head and brain.
Do you remember where you hit her with the tire iron, Paul? Did you hit her 1 time, 2 times?
Must have been about 30 times, but I mean, a good 20 times I think it was.
Were you swinging it this way, or did you poke her with it? Or do you
I don't think I poked her. No. I remember just hitting her mainly on the forehead, on the cheek, and the jaw, the mouth, and the top of the head. And I think it was only about 10 times, because then I know you must really be hurting in that, with a steel bar like that. I was even hurt when I went back to the car. Oh, there's going like this. I mean, and that's what made me want to go to the phone. I mean, I really wanted to help her. My mind started clearing up. What are you doing? You had a chance to make another friend, I kept yelling at myself. You like to make friends.
At 3 a.m. Paul Stephani made his first call to the police. He told the dispatcher to send an ambulance to Pierce Butler Road, Malberg Manufacturing Company machine shop, because there was a girl hurt there.
Yes, please, this is an emergency. Please send a squad to Pierce Butler Road, Malberg Manufacturing Company machine shop. Please, there's an ambulance too. There's a girl hurt there.
Can you tell me what happened to her?
Just hurry, she's laying on the ground in the back by the railroad tracks, by the edge here. Hurry.
What's the address?
I don't know.
Who are you?
At the location indicated by Paul, police officers found Karen Potak stripped nude, abandoned in a snowbank near the rail tracks. Karen had sustained serious injuries to her neck and head. The attack was so brutal, her skull had cracked and her brain was exposed. The blows were delivered with so much power, it broke the skin of her face as if she had been cut with a knife. Investigators found pieces of broken buttons 50 feet from where the victim was attacked. The attack left her disabled for the rest of her life, but despite the seriousness of her injuries, Karen Potak survived the incident. Unfortunately, Karen was never able to identify her attacker. Due to the damage she suffered to her brain, she had no recollections of the incident. Victim number 2. Kimberly Compton. On June 3, 1981, Paul Stephani murdered his second victim. Her name was Kimberly Compton, an 18-year-old student from Wisconsin. Kimberly had recently graduated from high school and moved to Minneapolis to search for a job. A few hours after arriving in Minneapolis, Kimberly went to a diner to have something to eat. In this diner, she met Paul Stephani. They talked, and he offered to show her the city at night.
And then that's when she started telling me where she was from, in Wisconsin and all that. And I says, hey, why don't you, I'm not even thinking about her right now. I said, hey, why don't you let me show you around town? I said, yeah, I want to show you something. There's really a nice view over here. And you see the nice river. I think I mentioned somebody you can probably have something to tell your parents about them.
She accepted the offer. Paul then took her to a secluded area and attacked her.
As I walked out of the car, I carried my knife with me. I had every intention to hurt her. We lay down in the grass, and I remember opening up her bra and everything, just feeling stuff, and they just started stabbing her.
The investigators described the attack as extreme rage. Paul stabbed Kimberly Compton 61 times with an ice pick. Kimberly suffered wounds to her chest, stomach, and inner thighs. While Kimberly was dying from the stabbing, Paul took a shoelace from his boot and strangled her. A group of teenagers playing in a field near a freeway construction site found the body the next day. The body was examined by a pathologist and he noticed the characteristic shape of the punctures. This led him to determine that the attacker had used an ice pick to commit the murder. Initially, investigators were unable to identify the corpse. Kimberly had no identification on her at the time of her death, but the investigators found a small locker key in her pocket. The investigators searched around and found out that the key was from a locker at the bus station. Inside the locker, investigators found 2 bags. The bags contained books and an ID that allowed them to finally identify the victim. 48 hours after Kimberly's murder, on the 5th of June, the police received a phone call from Paul claiming he had stabbed somebody with an ice pick.
Oh, you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody.
Hello? Are you there?
The police tried to locate the call, but they were unable because it was too short. The investigators analyzed the recordings, and became sure the caller had to be Kimberly's killer. Paul Stephani said he had used an ice pick to stab her. This information had not been revealed to the public at the time, only the killer could have known. A few hours later, Paul Stephani called again.
Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. Don't know why I had to stab her. I am so upset about it. I keep getting drunk every night. I can't believe it. It's just like a big dream. I can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'll kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else.
This time, the call was long enough for the investigators to locate it. The call was made from a phone booth near a bus station depot. A unit was sent there to apprehend the caller, but when they got there, Paul had already left. On the next day, the 6th of June, Paul Stephani called a newspaper to apologize for having killed Kimberly and to correct them on details of the murder. Investigators set up a surveillance near the phone booth where Paul had made the call, hoping he would return to call again. But unfortunately, he never did, and the police had to give up on the surveillance with no results. After the death of Kimberly Compton, the police searched the archives and found the phone call made by Paul Stephani when he attacked Karen Potak. They recognized it was the same voice, and they understood they were dealing with a serial killer. After this incident, the police started referring to him as the Weepy Voiced Killer, due to the high-pitched voice he used to make the calls. Paul's voice was very characteristic, so investigators felt there was a good chance someone could recognize him.
A special direct line has been set up now, and the police are asking anyone with any information on this case to call.
On several occasions, media stations broadcasted the recordings of the phone calls from the Weepy Voiced Killer,
hoping that somebody will recognize the voice.
The police received over 150 calls from the public, but they failed to provide the identity of the attacker.
Officials say at this point they have not been able to positively identify the voice of the caller.
Paul did not call again for a long time, and after this failure, and the failure of the phone booth surveillance, the police had reached a dead end in the investigation. Alan Lopez's false confession. A few months after the death of Kimberly, a domestic dispute that ended up with a man kidnapping his family at gunpoint gave investigators hope they had found the Weepy Voiced Killer. Police was alerted about the hostage situation, moved to the location, and surrounded the house. The police started negotiations with Alan Lopez to release the hostages. During the incident, Alan Lopez confessed to the police he was Kimberly Compton's killer. He ended up murdering his parents and sister. Then he surrendered to the police and was arrested. He was sent to a mental institution, and while institutionalized he kept saying he was the Weepy Voiced Killer. The investigators checked Alan Lopez's background to confirm if he could have been the Weepy Voiced Killer. They found out Lopez was institutionalized in a mental health facility at the time of Kimberly Compton's death. But on the day of her murder, Alan had received a day pass to leave the institution. Police then checked Alan's whereabouts during the attack of Karen Potak. The police found out that when Karen Potak was attacked, Alan had been arrested and was under custody. They also compared the recordings of both callers, and they understood it was not the same man. 6 months later, Alan Lopez committed suicide. Victim number 3. Kathleen Greening. On July 21, 1982, the corpse of Kathleen Greening was found. Kathleen Greening was a 33-year-old schoolteacher who was found dead at her home, drowned in her bathtub. The house was located outside St. Paul. On this occasion, Paul Stephani did not call the police. This murder was only connected to him much later when he confessed to his crimes.
You say that you both got into the tub?
Yes.
And you're positive about that?
Yes. Because I mean, I remember when I pushed her head underwater, I could see her face.
Did you push her in by push her head down, or did you push her in the chest area under the water? Or
I held her shoulders down.
You held her shoulders down? Both hands then?
Yeah.
I remember smiling a little bit, and it looked like we were playing a game. Then I just shook my hands away, and I actually said to myself, "What are you doing? She's dying."
Kathleen Greening had planned to go on a trip with a friend. It was this friend that found the body the next day. She arrived at the house and found the door open. She knocked at the door, but no one answered. So she entered and found Kathleen dead in the bathtub. For a long time, the police suspected of her husband. But with lack of evidences, they ended up declaring the cause of her death as accidental. Victim number 4. Barbara Simons. Since Paul Stephani never called the police to warn them about Kathleen Greening's murder, the police did not receive another phone call from him since the murder of Kimberly Compton. So between the death of Kimberly Compton and his 4th victim, Barbara Simons, 14 months went by without any phone call from the Weepy Voiced Killer. 2 weeks after murdering Kathleen Greening, Paul Stephani claimed his 4th victim, Barbara Simons, on the 6th of August, 1982. Barbara Simons was a 40-year-old nurse working on the Minneapolis side of the Mississippi River. The two met at the Hexagon Bar in Minneapolis. Paul Stephani asked her for a cigarette, and both started a conversation. They kept on talking, and later Barbara told the waitress, "He's cute. I hope he's nice, since he's giving me a ride home." Later, the waitress stated to have seen both leaving the bar together. Barbara Simons was found dead the next day. A paper boy was doing his routine deliveries along the banks of the Mississippi River when he found Barbara's glasses on the ground. The boy then spotted a woman's body. Initially, he thought it was a dummy, but when he touched it, he understood it was a corpse. Barbara Simons was sexually assaulted and stabbed more than 100 times. This time the punctures had a small circular shape, which made the police believe Paul Stephani had used a screwdriver to kill her. Once again, the investigators described the attack as having a lot of rage involved. 2 days later, after the body was found, Paul Stephani called the police.
Fire emergency.
Please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one over at St. Paul. I don't know what's the matter with me. I'm sick. I'm going to kill myself, I think.
Where are you?
I'm just going to... If somebody dies with a red shirt on, it's me. I killed both of them. I'm sorry. I'll never make it to heaven.
Calm down.
The police were unable to identify the corpse because, like Kimberly, Barbara had no identification on her. A post worker found a purse in a mailbox near the bus station where Kimberly Compton had left her bags. The post worker called the police and surrendered the purse. Inside the purse, the police found the identification of Barbara Simons. The investigators then interrogated Barbara's acquaintances. Some of her friends told the police the last time they had talked to her, she had told them she was going to a local bar called the Hexagon. The bartender and a waitress remembered to have seen Barbara talking to a white male with a mustache and a muscular body type. With this description, investigators compiled a collection of mugshots of criminals that had been involved with violent crimes and showed them to them. Among the mugshots was the one of Paul Stephani, from when he had been convicted for aggravated assault. The bartender and the waitress recognized him at once. Now the police had finally a suspect and began investigating Paul Stephani. They were able to connect him to his first victim, Karen Potak. Paul had worked at the Malmberg Manufacturing Company. He had been fired from his job in March 1977, 3 years before Karen Potak was found at that same location. Although Paul Stephani was their main suspect, the investigators did not have enough proofs to arrest him. While trying to collect more evidence, the investigators set up a surveillance operation to prevent him from attacking another woman. Victim number 5. Denise Williams. On August 21, 1982, and while under surveillance, Paul Stephani made a trip to Minneapolis. The police followed him, but they lost him in the middle of the traffic. Paul went then to the red light district and picked a sex worker named Denise Williams, 21 years of age. He took her to a motel, and they had sex. Paul then offered Denise to drive her back to the district. Denise accepted the ride, but she realized something was wrong when Paul drove through a dark, secluded area rather than heading back toward downtown. To tranquilize her, Paul told her he was taking a shortcut, but Denise didn't trust him. She saw a glass bottle in the car and planned to use it if Paul tried to harm her. Somewhere in East Minneapolis, he pulled over to the side of the road. Paul then grabbed a screwdriver out of his glove compartment and stabbed Denise in her stomach several times. Despite the wounds, Denise was able to fight back. She grabbed the glass bottle and smashed it across his face. The bottle broke and caused cuts on Paul's face and head. Denise said when she cut him, his blood gushed into her eyes, blinding her momentarily. Denise then jumped out of the car and screamed for help. Paul launched to grab her, fell on top of her in the street, and kept attacking her. A man who lived nearby heard the screams, and came over to help. He saw Paul trying to stab Denise while she was desperately trying to defend herself. The man confronted Paul. Paul stood and threatened to kill him if he would intervene. Then the man told Paul he was going to call the police, and ran back to his home. Paul understood the police would be there in minutes. He stopped the attack, and fled the scene in his car, leaving a trail of blood behind. The man then called the police and an ambulance. Denise was stabbed a total of 13 times. She was bleeding profusely, but she survived the attack. Later, the man served also as a witness to identify Paul during the trial. Paul Stephani apprehension. Paul Stephani returned to his apartment, but he was bleeding so profusely he knew he needed medical attention. Paul then called the emergency number and asked for an ambulance.
I need an ambulance.
Where?
1505 Westminster.
1505
Yes,
Westminster. What's the problem?
I'm all cut up. I got beat up.
What's your apartment number?
208, I'm bleeding.
208. Where are you bleeding from?
From my arm, my face, my head.
An ambulance was sent to his address. The surveillance team stationed at Paul's house saw the ambulance and started to make phone calls to find out what had happened. They asked to hear the emergency call made by Paul Stephani. Although this time he did not speak with a high-pitched weepy voice like the other times, the police were able to identify him. Then they called the hospital and asked if any person had been attacked recently. They were informed about the attack on Denise Williams. The description of the attack matched Paul Stephani's wounds, so they suspected Paul had been the attacker. To confirm their suspicions, the police went to the hospital to talk to Denise, and showed her several mugshots. Denise was able to identify Paul Stephani in one of the mugshots. The police also searched his car and found it covered with blood. Paul Stephani was apprehended by the police and charged with the murder of Barbara Simons and attempting murder of Denise Williams. Later, the police interrogated Paul Stephani about the murders, but he denied having committed any of the crimes. He said that the cuts on his face happened because he was a victim of an assault robbery. Interrogation. Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece of 1960, tells a story of a motel owner, Norman Bates, who goes into a killing frenzy every time he gets sexually aroused. According to the plot of the movie, to be able to kill, Norman Bates had to change his personality to his alter ego, his deceased mother.
They'll see. They'll see and they'll know and they'll say, why, she wouldn't even harm a fly.
Psycho's plot came to my mind when I heard the detective describing what happened during the interrogation with Paul Stephani. The investigator said that during the interrogation, Paul Stephani talked to him in a low, calm voice. But when the investigator opened the file of the Weepy Voiced Killer and started showing him the photos of the victims, Paul Stephani stood from the chair and started speaking in a high-pitched voice and said, "You are not gonna pin those on me." The detective said his voice became exactly like the voice of the Weepy Voiced Killer, and according to him, it was as if Paul Stephani had changed his personality right in front of his eyes. Trial. During Paul Stephani's trial, his sister was called by the prosecutors to testify in court. She said she believed the hysterical caller known as the Weepy Voiced Killer was indeed the voice of Paul Stephani. A sound expert was also called to testify that the voices of the phone calls belonged to the same person. However, these statements were not enough to legally assert Paul Stephani as the Weepy Voiced Killer. Despite all the evidences against him, Paul Stephani didn't confess his crimes. But the state had enough proofs to condemn him for the death of Barbara Simons and the attempt of murder of Denise Williams. Paul Stephani was convicted of both counts and sentenced to 18 years for the attack on Denise Williams and 40 years for Barbara Simons' murder. Both sentences to be served concurrently. Confessions. More than a decade later, in 1997, Paul Stephani was diagnosed with skin cancer and had less than a year to live. As a devoted Christian, Paul Stephani decided then to confess his crimes to be in peace with God. In return, he just asked for one thing: a photograph of his mother's headstone.
Killing seemed to be the thing you were supposed to do. That was part of life. Driving the car was part of life. Eating food was part of life. To me, it seemed like killing was part of life. Until I did it, and then I drove away, and then I looked like the one on Pierce Petter Road. What are you doing? And then I just couldn't turn myself in. That's why I kept getting on the phone. Will you catch me and stop me, or catch me, or something like that? Or...
In an interview with an investigator, Paul Stephani admitted to having beaten Karen Podak in 1980, to have stabbed Kimberly Compton to death in 1981, to have stabbed Barbara Simons to death in 1982, as well to have stabbed Denise Williams in 1982. Additional to these crimes that the police had already connected to him, he also confessed to having drowned a woman in 1982, but he couldn't remember her name or address. The investigator researched unsolved cases that matched his description and found a match: Kathleen Greening. She was found dead in her bathtub in 1982 in her house. Paul Stephani was able to describe the house correctly, and also told the police he had stolen her purse and stuffed it in a mailbox. This information had never been disclosed to the public, only the killer could have known. The investigators also searched Kathleen Greening's address book and found a Paul S. name on her list. This number she had on her list was later confirmed to belong to Paul Stephani. The red color. In another of Alfred Hitchcock's movies, Marnie, from 1964, it depicts a traumatized thief that is triggered by a succession of colors that throws her into a frenzied state.
The building is grounded, Mrs. Taylor. You're quite safe here. From the lightning.
The colors. Stop the colors.
What colors?
There is a similar theory that involves Paul Stephani and the color red. According to a local reporter, Caroline Lowe, who covered the serial killer for WCCO TV, she noticed that all Paul's victims were wearing a piece of cloth that was red. This was never confirmed or denied by Paul himself, but in one of his phone calls, he does mention the red color.
I don't know what's the matter with me. I'm sick. I'm gonna kill myself, I think.
Where are you?
If somebody dies with a red shirt on, it's me. I killed both of them. I'm sorry. I'll never make it to heaven.
Calm down.
Could it really be that the unlucky victims were chosen only because they were wearing red? This fact might be an insignificant piece of trivia, but I cannot help myself from feeling intrigued. Motivation.
You don't know how many times I just sat in dark alleys or go back to the street and just sit there and just talk, and thought. I mean, what is going on here? There was somebody telling me, Paul, it's time to kill. Paul, it's time to kill.
Paul Stephani said there was a voice in his head that told him to kill. He also said that after one of the murders, he went to a Catholic church, sat in the back of the pew, and cried.
I went to a Catholic church late at night. I mean, I sat in the back of the pew one night and I cried. I mean, Mother had always told me, if something hurts you, go to God.
Killing seemed to be the thing you were supposed to do. That was part of life.
I'm trying to find out the reason why you pick somebody up at a restaurant. 15 minutes later, you stabbed him to death. I don't know why.
It is not clear why Paul Stephani felt the urge to murder, but Detective Brown, who investigated the case, had a theory. He learned that prior to starting murdering, Paul Stephani had a relationship with a Syrian woman. Not much is known about the relationship, but one day she left him and returned to her country for an arranged marriage. Detective Brown believed Paul Stephani felt betrayed by her, and this upset him so much that he started having revenge fantasies. And since his former girlfriend was no longer around for him to take revenge, he started attacking other women as if they were her. The phone calls. It is very rare for a killer to call the police after committing a crime, but it is not unheard of. When other killers call the police to confess their crimes, they do it because they want to taunt the police or to receive an ego boost. The case of Paul Stephani is different because he sounded to be in genuine pain, and deeply tormented by his own actions. The question that remains to be answered is, why did Paul Stephani do those creepy phone calls to the police? The answer lies in his religious upbringing. According to the Christian religion, one needs first to confess his sins to be absolved from them. This was the way Paul Stephani was raised. Experts have suggested that it was his strong religious beliefs that were tormenting him, and the phone call would give him some peace of mind. But the same experts believe he never had any intention of surrendering. He only did it to feel a little better about himself. It was as if he was confessing to the police so they could absolve him of his crimes. Death. Paul Michael Stephani died on June 12, 1998, at the age of 53 from cancer.
I ain't saying I don't deserve to go to hell. I mean, if somebody killed my sister, I'd say to myself, geez, they deserve hell. But I mean, I just say it's up to God. I'll take whatever God gives me.